Good evening, everyone. My name is Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture at the College of the Holy Cross. The McFarland Center is really pleased to sponsor this event as part of a semester-long series of events titled Repairing the Fabric of Our Nation. It's our attempt to address with our students and alumni the political and social crisis that culminated in the January 6th insurrection in the Capitol. I'm especially grateful to our congressional guests who are with us today and Congressman McGovern, and all our viewers for joining us. I encourage you to check some of the videos of our prior events on the series that are on the McFarland Center website. They've been really thought-provoking events, as I know this one will be tonight. 3 Holy Cross alumni were seated in Congress on January 6th at the insurrection. And we wanted to bring them together for a conversation on the breakdown of our democracy that helped lead to the event and, more importantly, to talk about how we can move forward from it, how we repair the torn fabric of our political life in ways that can serve all Americans better. In a moment, Father Burrows will offer a word of welcome, as will our own Worcester Congressman, a great friend of the college and friend of the 3 alumni in Congress, Representative Jim McGovern. As some of you may recall, he was presiding in Congress when the chamber was breached. But before I introduce them, let me introduce our guests. The 3 alumni we welcome are distinguished members of Congress who have deep connections to the College of the Holy Cross. Born and raised in Scranton, Pennsylvania, Senator Bob Casey graduated from Holy Cross in 1982 and spent the following year teaching 5th grade and coaching 8th grade basketball in inner city Philadelphia and for the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. He served in as Pennsylvania State Treasurer and Auditor General before being elected to the Senate in 2006. Senator Casey has championed legislation for individuals with disabilities, on early childhood education, the elimination of campus sexual violence, job growth, and infrastructure. He serves on 4 committees that combine 9 issue areas: the Committee on Finance, Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, the Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, the Special Committee on Aging. His Holy Cross connections are extensive. His late father, Robert Casey Sr., served for 8 years as governor of Pennsylvania. 4 siblings in Senator Casey's generation attended Holy Cross, and 3 more Caseys in the next generation have followed up the Casey legacy on the Hill. College Hill, that is, not Capitol Hill. Senator Bob Casey and his father are both honorary degree recipients, and Senator Casey was a commencement speaker. He and his wife, Senator Casey and his wife, Teresa, have 4 daughters. Congressman Mark DeSaulnier, who represents California's 11th district in the Bay Area, studied history at Holy Cross, graduating in 1974. After graduation, he owned and managed several successful Bay Area restaurants for many years. He served as a city councilman and mayor, was a member of the California State Assembly, and served as a California state senator. In 2014, he was elected to Congress. Since then, he's focused on guaranteeing a livable wage, affordable and accessible education, ensuring that government is accountable to the public. He sits on 4 committees: the House Rules Committee, the Transportation and Infrastructure, Education and Labor, where he serves as chair of the Subcommittee on Health, Employment, Labor, and Pensions, and the Committee on Oversight and Reform. Congressman DeSaulnier is also from a Holy Cross family. His father is the class of 42, and 2 siblings are alums. He has 2 sons, is an avid runner, and completed 21 marathons. After graduating from Holy Cross in 1969, Congressman Peter Welch went to work fighting housing discrimination in Chicago as one of the first Robert F. Kennedy Fellows. He earned a law degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and moved to Vermont to practice law. He served in the Vermont State Senate and was elected to the Chambers as the Chamber's president pro tem. He was elected to Congress in 2006, representing the state of Vermont. His focus has been to work across the aisle to create jobs, increase access to affordable education and healthcare, invest in energy efficiency, protect our environment, and care for our veterans. He is Chief Deputy Whip in the House Democratic Caucus and a member of the Democratic Steering and Policy Committee. He serves on the House Intelligence Committee and the Committee on Energy and Commerce. Congressman Welch's father graduated from Holy Cross in 1937, and 3 of his siblings attended Holy Cross as well. His wife, Margaret Cheney, is commissioner of the Vermont Public Utility Commission. Father Burrows, beyond those great achievements that these alums have, that adds up to a lot of tuitions that help build Holy Cross up. And I hope I didn't miss anyone in anyone's family. I'll welcome Father Burrows to welcome them and Jim McGovern.
Great, thank you. Good evening. As president of the College of the Holy Cross, it is both a privilege and an honor to welcome you to tonight's conversation, College Hill on Capitol Hill, how our alumni in Congress would heal the nation. Our three alums will be just been introduced by our convener, Tom Landy. But first, our local representative to Congress, Jim McGovern, will also say a few words. While not an alum, and Jim, I'm not an alum either, as I have observed over the past 10 years, you truly live our Holy Cross mission, and I consider you a good friend. We traveled together to El Salvador for the 25th anniversary of the killing of the Jesuits and their companions in 2014. And as I mentioned to our students earlier, I was Jim's guest in Congress when Pope Francis spoke in the Capitol. Jim, along with Bob and Peter and Mark, witnessed to the vocation of public service by the quality of their work, their values, and their decisions. You've heard all the lists of the committees they serve on and the ways in which they directly affect our lives here in our country. Now, I firmly believe that as a vocation, what they do is a calling from God. For us, they have given their lives, and sometimes close to it, to ensure that we as a diverse and privileged people experience equality, justice, inclusion, and also openness to the needs of the most vulnerable in the United States and in our world. And for all of our students participating tonight, I hope that you too will be open to discern a similar calling with equal courage, generosity, and selflessness. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Burrows. Representative McGovern, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. And let me say that I'm really honored to be opening up for this incredible, distinguished group of members of Congress and a United States Senator. I think some of the most accomplished people in the world are Holy Cross graduates. As Father Burrows pointed out, I'm not one of them. But in fact, I was rejected when I applied. But you know what? I love you anyway. But I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, I want to thank Father Burrows for his friendship over the years and for his leadership, not only on campus but in our community. And as he mentioned, he was witness to the anniversary of the martyred Jesuits in El Salvador, and it made me so proud to be in the audience while he was co-celebrating Mass there, and because it was such a meaningful part of my life when I worked for Joe Moakley investigating those murders. But to have the president of Holy Cross College there as a witness, I think was a powerful, powerful statement. And we're going to miss him. And so I just want to say thank you for everything that you've done. And then my colleagues, Father Burrows talked about the commitment to justice and the Jesuit values. These three individuals really do live up to that every day. I've worked with Senator Casey on a lot of initiatives to combat hunger in our country. And I'm a huge fan and admire his leadership in the Senate. And Peter Welsh and Mark DeSaulnier, I mean, Mark and I are on the Rules Committee together, and so we spend an awful lot of time together. And even though he represents California, he's from Massachusetts, and he knows Worcester, and especially where McGovern's package store is. And so I really admire his priorities, and he understands kind of the Massachusetts sense of humor. And Peter Welsh, was on the Rules Committee. We served on the Rules Committee for a while. Again, a leader on efforts of peace and justice and fighting hunger, all the things that I think represent the best of Holy Cross's traditions. So in any event, I'm just happy to be witness to this, and I'm thrilled that they're participating in this virtual event, and look forward to hearing them. But I will now turn you over to the best and brightest in Congress.
Thank you, Representative McGovern. And I'll point out to everyone that there are still votes happening today. So some of our members may be in and out unless they've delegated things, as we'll talk about with the students. One particularly important vote that happened today. So there may be some people moving around their iPhones running in to vote on things as we go along. So welcome. Let me ask, I'll ask a few framing questions for our representatives and senator before we come to the students. And I know we want to get to the students. All of you were in Capitol Hill on January 6th, and you've seen a lot of divisive events in recent years. Just briefly, are we at a singular moment when it comes to a moment of crisis compared to the rest of your lives? Does this stand out?
Well, I'll start. Of course it stands out. I mean, you literally had two things happen. There's a history here. But what January 6th represented was two things that we, in my experience, have never had before. First of all, you had a challenge to the outcome of election and the peaceful transfer of power. You know, and since 1789, we've done something that on one level is very routine. We've had a peaceful transfer of power. On another level, it's very extraordinary because we've had a peaceful transfer of power. That was challenged. And the folks who came here believed that the election had been rigged, and and this gets us to the second thing. There was the use of violence to try to win your political point of view. So this is an extraordinary moment for the country. It's an interesting discussion about how we got here, but it is unique. There was a challenge to the peaceful transfer, and there was use of violence as a tactic to try to achieve your goal. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, Doctor, maybe I'll jump in here. Let me start by saying thank you for this opportunity, Dr. Landy and Father Burrows, and it's great to be with my fellow alumni, Peter and Mark, and it's great to have Jim McGovern. Jim, I think if there was a Jesuit at Holy Cross in the 1970s or 80s who said, this is the kind of member of Congress you should be, you would probably be the model for that. And I'm so grateful for your leadership and your willingness to join us tonight. But I'm going to be brutally honest about my feelings about how I view some Senate colleagues and actually some House colleagues after January the 6th. I can't get by it. I mean, I know we're taught to forgive, and that's an article of our faith. But for example, there are two members of the Senate, thank God it's only two, who led the objection to the Electoral College results. And those objections that were lodged against the votes cast in my home state of Pennsylvania and Arizona, those objections were based upon a lie, a falsehood. It's not a difference of opinion. It's not a different philosophy or ideology. It was a lie. And if you act in furtherance of the lie on something as constitutionally sacred as the Electoral College, I can't get by that. And I'm not going to work with those senators. I'm not going to engage them. I'm just going to keep them in a category all by themselves. Another group that I can't get beyond, I just say it plainly, I can't forgive the 8 members of the Pennsylvania delegation. Thankfully, there was at least one Republican in that delegation. But 8 of the 9 Republicans in my home state's delegation supported the objection to Pennsylvania's electoral votes being counted. The same election that they had just benefited from, having been reelected by the voters of the state whose electoral votes they rejected. So I can't get beyond that. Now, when you move away from January the 6th, we can talk more about it, but there are lots of ways I think we have to try to put aside our differences. But what played out on January the 6th wasn't just a series of acts of violence by American citizens against their government, but there were constitutional crimes committed that day, not only by the president, but by some members of Congress. And I can't get beyond that. Sorry to start on such a negative note, but I want to be honest with you.
Tom, first let me just say, in addition, what an honor it is to be invited and be with this group, and with Jim McGovern. Jim, you weren't here for Tom's introductions, but your mistake was your father didn't go to Holy Cross. Apparently, the three of us, at least in my case, I was the legacy. I think Senator Casey and I know Peter were much smarter than I am. So. Thanks to Jim McGovern, a wonderful colleague, and to my colleagues, and Father Burrows, as Jim said, we wish you well, but it's a great loss for the Holy Cross and for Holy Cross and the community. And I would just concur with my two colleagues. I've got some post-traumatic stress to think of Americans attacking that building. And I am the newest member of Congress, just entering my fourth term. I know we all get goosebumps when we enter that building, the architecture, the history. So to see Americans, as Senator Casey said, attack that building in the manner they did, given the premise they had to do it, when 50 courts had said not only was it a lie, but there was no evidence at all to substantiate the then sitting president of the United States argument. So we are in challenging times in a crisis. Having said that, my kids, my two sons, gave me a book when I first got elected to Congress that was somewhat good reading for me, called "There Will Be Blood," talking about the history of physical altercations in Congress. And of course, we know the famous one, Senator Sumner. So in that context, we've had tough times before, but we're in a tough one now. And there's a lot of underlying things that Peter said that I think we all agree are helping these along: social media inequality, questions about race, all contributed to January 6th, but these are really challenging times.
So that's a good lead into the next question, one that the students were very interested in seeing asked too. Is this a larger systemic structural thing? Can we say this is one man in one passing moment? How do we begin to think about this? Is it over at the inauguration, or what's the root of it?
Go ahead.
I didn't mean to jump ahead of Peter on that, but Dr. Landy, if you're talking about what's at the root of the insurrection itself, the attack, the event, there's probably a lot we could talk about, but I think at the base of it, at least in my judgment, is white supremacy. That's what seemed to anger a lot of those Americans, that somehow they were losing control of the world that they felt that they had a right to dominate, or they seem to be very upset about not just the changing of transition of power or transfer of power, but that they were somehow losing when Donald Trump lost the election, that they were somehow losing out. And I think a lot of that is white supremacy. Doesn't explain the appearance or the engagement by every single member of that mob, but I think for a lot of folks, that's where it starts. And shame on us if we don't begin to wrestle with that and to begin to address it. So there's a lot more to talk about, but I think that's at the core of it.
You know, Bob, it's really interesting hearing you say that, because I think you have the most complicated electoral challenge. I mean, Pennsylvania is extraordinarily diverse and very large, and you know, the famous saying is you've got those urban areas in Mississippi in between, so you're always wrestling with different cultures and different political dynamics, and you know, thank goodness you've succeeded. I think there's two things that are in addition to that. You know, I think there has been in this country, and this is where I think there's a real challenge for all of us, but especially on our side, stagnation in incomes for very hardworking people, where their identity was not just that they were white people, but their identity was they had a job, they had a neighborhood, they had stability, they had confidence that their kids maybe would get in the Holy Cross and be able to be better off than they were. And that's really been challenged. we have an economy now where income inequality is literally built into the transmission system. And you've had half of our population in this country in the past 30 years have not had a raise, literally. A lot of folks in Pennsylvania, Bob, I know you deal with it. They literally haven't had a raise. And then you add to it what I think is the unforeseen effects of social media, where instead of having a neighborhood you go to, instead of having diverse people that some you like, some you don't, but you all are on sort of the same parish or you're in the same union, you get your information and you get your reinforcement from an atomized cohort that is presented to you through the algorithmic magic of social media. And so it's a toxic combination, because if people are working really hard, but the opportunities are really diminished, they're not able to, they're really anxious about paying their bills. They look at the evening news and the people like themselves are never on it. Yet on the other hand, there's this enormous wealth accumulation that's occurring, but they're not going to be part of it, and their kids probably aren't. That's a political challenge that we've not faced. And frankly, I think the American Rescue Package is the first time where we've done something where the benefits are universal. Everybody in the most rural part of Pennsylvania and everybody in the urban Pennsylvania is going to get that check or get the benefit of that shot. And I think that's frankly something that's overdue on our side. So I think it's a combination of a failure at the political level to contend with the forces of income stagnation and opportunity that create a very, very fertile ground for an alternative explanation, which is to blame it on Black and brown and gay and take your pick. And obviously we had a president like Trump had kind of a feral genius for finding those cleavages. So I think it's what Senator Casey said, but I also think that the long-term challenges are on us, not just on Republicans, for not having economic policies that addressed the dynamics in the economy, globalization, outsourcing of jobs, the rise of technology, all these things that are very disruptive, and now we have to face.
Thanks. Congressman DeSaulnier, do you want to add to that, or do you?
I don't know if I can add too much, but I agree with both sentiments about race and about inequality. If you read Thomas Piketty's work, as hard as it is to read, and Emmanuel Saez, who's now next door to me at Berkeley, it's pretty inevitable by their economic history research that when you get this level of inequality, as Peter said, their premise is it's inevitable you have these social issues and they're played out in the streets, either by war or these kind of actions. So I think of what happened is, in that context, fairly symptomatic, as I do with the former president, I can't say his name, I'm sorry, that he was uniquely talented to play to instinctively, I think, and intuitively to these passions that I think both Bob and Peter talked about victimization, that white male patriarchal rule was being threatened. And he played to that very well. And we know in history that once you've convinced yourself you're being victimized, it allows you to rationalize almost anything. And I would advise, if you read Robert Putnam's work, particularly his last book, he compares this history, which I completely agree with, and his issues that Peter alluded to about third places and institutions of community. I used to be in the restaurant business, so it resonates with me. But Putnam talked about the late 1800s and 1900s being so similar to this period in terms of travel, immigration, the development of steam travel, both for rail and ships, and for the immigration issue, and the disbursement of facts through the telegraph. So this is a similar period, I think, that the young people will live through And we know when we know neuroscience, from a neuroscience standpoint now, that humans were hardwired to only be able to be capable of taking so much change. And then lastly, just because I'm from the Bay Area and have had strong relationships with the tech community over my public service, and I don't have those kind of relationships right now because I think they're responsible for this and haven't demonstrated appropriate social responsibility, particularly Facebook and social media companies. The ability for these groups to create their own reality is, I think, unlike any time in human history that I'm aware of. There's a book called The Sociology of Reality, which was about 40 years ago by a sociologist, that talks about how we all become socialized by the institutions, the families we have. And basically they say that people don't become socialized, are not a danger to a larger society, but unless, and this is written in the 50s, unless they start to connect. And then I think that's what technology and social media, without us setting the parameters of that conversation as a community, has led to this reality that Senator Casey talked about and our colleagues, where you try to reach out to colleagues to heal, and then you realize their reality is so different from yours that it's very hard, and it's very firmly entrenched and reinforced to bridge that. So that's something I think
Thanks.
your students are going to have to probably live out.
I like that you framed a lot of books. Bob Putnam spoke about that book at the McFarland Center just before it came out, so we'll put in a plug. That's still online. We're going to walk over with Congressman Welch over to vote while we're en route. And I want to turn over to the students, but just frame it in a larger sense. You know, we've talked about bipartisanship, and we've talked about whether partisan solutions are going to be necessary to solve things and how you can contribute. And one of the questions that came in, maybe just quickly, if you can look at it, was from the submissions that we had. Is it worth eliminating the filibuster to get things accomplished? The Congress, we've had a lesson about how hard it is to accomplish things in primarily the Senate because of the filibuster rule. Is it worth going that option? Mitch McConnell says no, but I don't know what you say.
I say yes.
Wow.
I probably wouldn't have said, I'm certain I wouldn't have said that 2 years ago, but I've reached a point of real conversion when I reflect upon what we have to do now in terms of what I would argue would be imperatives. For example, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, HR 1, the For the People Act, those measures like that cannot await the passage of time, especially when we know that there's a determined effort, which is not at all camouflaged or nuanced across the country in state legislatures, to deny people either the right to vote or to make it a lot more difficult to vote. I think Senator Raphael Warnock yesterday gave a great, and I recommend it to anyone, gave a great floor speech, his first, talking about voting rights. And one line that he uttered was simple, but kind of encapsulates the whole problem. He said, he said something like, it seems to me that some people don't want some people to vote. And when you have that threat, really what constitutional scholars would call a clear and present danger, when you have that, you're confronted with that. You can't simply say, well, that's not how the system works in the Senate. We have this tradition or rule. That's just an inadequate answer to the moral moment that we're either in or we're going to be in when we face the crossroads of whether we're going to expand the opportunity to vote or not. For example, in Pennsylvania, we're in some ways a very, in terms of electoral mechanics, we were pretty backward for a long time. No early voting, no ability to vote by absentee, other than a very laborious process that didn't suit modern voting. Kind of a closed system in a lot of ways. The legislature thankfully passed a bill in 2019, not knowing, of course, there'd be a pandemic, but allowing the kind of vote by mail that we were able to conduct in Pennsylvania. Thankfully, that happened well ahead of time. But now you're going to see, because of what happened in 2020, not just efforts to thwart some people from voting, but real kind of retrenchment instead of expanding the right to vote. I mean, why do we only vote on Tuesday historically? Why do we only vote, in Pennsylvania over the course of 13 hours, 7 a.m. to 8 p.m.? It doesn't make much sense. And I think now we have to take action. And the best way to do that is to change the rules, or at a minimum, I think, to say that we're gonna have a different set of voting rules for matters like voting rights. Maybe not every piece of legislation should be accorded that status, but I think this is one of those instances where the filibuster just doesn't make sense.
A consequential stand for a senator. What I'm going to do now, and we may get in a moment, I don't know if we get to go inside the House chamber with Representative Welch pretty soon, or he has to turn his phone off. But I want to introduce the students who are going to ask some questions now for a little bit. Victoria De Leon is a first-generation Latinx student from Denver, Colorado, a political science and Spanish double major with a concentration Latin America, Latinx, and Caribbean studies, currently participating in the spring Washington, D.C. semester, interning at the Capital Area Immigrants' Rights Coalition. Yesenia Gutierrez is from Sunnyvale, California, not too far away from Representative DeSaulnier. Studies political science, involved in the Latin American Student Organization, community-based learning, student government, and is passionate about immigration law, and has advocated for immigrant rights and served unaccompanied minors seeking asylum through an internship in Worcester. Dennis Liu is a first-generation Chinese-American political science major from Yarmouth, Massachusetts, works in admissions, residence life, housing department, and several Holy Cross bands and music ensembles. He's currently in the academic internship program, where he's a remote congressional intern for Congressman Bill Keating. And in the fall, he worked for Senator Ed Markey's reelection campaign, as well as for Massachusetts Democrats. Connor McInerney of the class of 22 is a political science major, a rhetoric composition minor from Sandy Hook, Connecticut, involved in student government, Pax Christi, Feminist Forum, Student Athletics Advisory Committee. He's on the men's cross country and track team. He worked on the Biden presidential campaign and is a member of the January semester program in Manchester, New Hampshire. Right now, he's working remotely at Flywheel Government Solutions and the DC semester program. So we've got 3 students with Democratic connections. I'll point out in the spirit of bipartisanship that one of the people who highly recommended them was one of the leaders who I admire of the college Republicans. So I will turn it over to the 4 of you.
Thank you, Professor. Good evening, everyone. Before we go into our student questions, we would like to thank Professor Landy, President Burrows, and Congressman Govern for their welcome addresses and making this event possible. We would also like to thank and welcome Representatives DeSaulnier, Welch, and Senator Casey for joining us tonight. I would like to now turn it over to Victoria to ask our first student question.
Thank you, Connor. Thank you all of you so much for being here today. My question for all of you is, as the fabric of America becomes increasingly more diverse and intersectional, how do each of you who hold privileged identities as white males believe you can hold yourself and your colleagues accountable to recognizing and attending to the issues of those with diverse identities?
Senator, rank has its privileges.
Well, Victoria, thank you for that question. And I think probably in the last 6 months or so, the last year really, I think I have a better awareness of my privileges probably than I ever did. Not the privileges that I knew that I grew up with, which was a 2-parent household, a father who had an income where we weren't wealthy, but we never were wanting. The opportunity to go to great schools, the opportunity to grow up in a community where I didn't have some of the pressures or traumas that a lot of young people face every day. But I've always, I hope, been thankful and for those advantages. But it's only in the last year, and it really, I think, a combination of what happened after the killing of George Floyd and the protests around the country, Black Lives Matter, and so many other a combination really of movements that began to challenge me to think about another set of privileges, which were tied to my race and my gender. So it's made me think long and hard about my obligation beyond just the debates about criminal justice itself, but to consider other areas of policy where I have to constantly think about or see these issues through a lens that I probably didn't see through before, or look or apply to those challenges. Whether it's and sometimes we use different words to describe them, but at their core, they're injustices. Not just the injustice of a system that allows a lot of Black men to be killed and abused, but also the injustices in housing, the injustices in education, the injustices in our economy, as both members of Congress spoke about those inequalities. So a range of challenges that confront us, and I hope that in my remaining time in the United States Senate, I know I have this job at least until the end of 2024, that I hope that I can live up to that obligation to consider every day the privileges that I have.
I would say embrace it. I am a survivor of cancer, and I've spent a lot of time out at NIH and here in the Bay Area at UCSF that gets next to Johns Hopkins, the largest amount of NIH funding. And what occurred to me through my personal experience with cancer is many of the people who have either contributed or largely contributed to the drugs that keep me alive are women and people of very diverse natures that aren't white men. So as a survivor of that disease, why would I want to preclude the best and the brightest, irrespective of gender or ethnicity or social preference or sexual preference? You want the best and the brightest. So I say embrace it. I think we can also look at a historical context, and certainly Holy Cross, in my experience, our parents' generation. I remember my Irish mother, who was the son of a Boston fireman. That was unusual, not unusual in those days. That was an iteration of what this country strives for, and we're part of that. And I would say this part of it is a further iteration, more dramatic in many ways, but this is what America aspires to. In my view, this is the American dream, this great melting pot, and it's becoming more of that rather than an aspiration. And certainly in California, it's been a great strength of ours. The Pacific Rim immigration that we are going through is not dissimilar from the immigration pattern that Putnam alludes to in his work on the Eastern Coast, where the Irish and the Italian, a lot of Catholics were having a struggle coming into places like Philadelphia and Boston, New York. We sort of have a similar thing that a noted researcher here and author Peter Schrag talks about. So I think your question is, you embrace it and realize that it's part of the journey that this life is, and you shouldn't be threatened by it. And that's part of, as the senator said, this is what people are holding on to. And to some degree, they feel like they are being victimized when we would look at it as they've had a disproportionate advantage for some time. Peter's back, and he's in the Rayburn room.
That's right. Well, just to add a little bit, one of the most thrilling parts about being a member of Congress is how you actually have to face the questions that you just asked. And, you know, I think about the Black Lives Matter movement and how powerful that was. And when I think about what happened to George Floyd, an officer that police officer Chauvin, when he was kneeling on George Floyd for those 9 minutes and 34 seconds. What was, in addition to just how horrific that was how casual it was. Mm-hmm. He had his hands in his pocket. he was doing something that he felt that was totally fine.
Yeah.
He thought his fellow colleagues had his back. This was, quote, okay. And that is, I think, what white America has not understood, is how ingrained these systems of preference and oppression are. And it's the legacy of slavery. It really is the legacy of slavery. And when you think about in 1619, you know, those 21 African Americans were brought over to Virginia on a ship, and it never stopped until the Civil War. And then we had in our Constitution, our founding document, African Americans were 3/5 of a citizen. Women didn't have the right to vote. And then we had the Civil War and the freeing of the slaves. And there was a period of 12 years in Reconstruction when African Americans were making enormous contributions in science, in Congress, in education. And then that horrible Hayes-Tilden compromise, where it led to the violation of civil rights and the introduction of Jim Crow and the condoning of violence as a mechanism to maintain white control. And that is the history of our country that's uncomfortable for a lot of people, but the Black Lives Matter movement has forced us to face this. And there is a reaction. I think Senator Casey really outlined how powerful that is. And he has to, you know, God bless you, Bob, because you've managed to uphold the highest traditions of democratic values in a place where there's a lot of hostility to that. So this is ongoing, but it's a challenge that we all face. One of the things that's so fantastic for Jim McGovern and Mark and me, we have all these new colleagues, people of color with enormous energy, enormous moral grounding, who are very strong advocates of the rights of people who've been oppressed, and are also just wonderful, practical, let's get something done doers here in Congress. And I think all of us have been humbled by the service of people like AOC and Ayanna Pressley and so many others that are really making a huge contribution here.
Doctor, do you mind if I just add a quick postscript to what I said? Because both Peter and Mark are reminding me of a couple things. Number one, you're seeing on display why the House is so much more efficient, because they have these really smart members who know their history, they know economics, and they can pass legislation quickly. In the Senate, we're not that smart. We take forever to get things done. So,
but
you're seeing the efficiency of the House. But in light of what both Peter and Mark just said, and I've been fairly negative tonight because of some of the challenges we face. I'll tell you, there's a lot to be optimistic about, and I want to say that to this next generation. We want to encourage you to run for office, not just get involved in policy. Run for office, because you'd all be good candidates, and we know you can lead. But there was a moment just a couple of weeks ago that in some ways crystallized the good that has happened. And probably the best example of good was the bill we just passed, right? That the rescue plan is probably the most significant piece of legislation I'll ever vote on, in terms of helping low-income families as well as a lot of middle-class families. And the rich were completely excluded, thankfully, for the first time in 40 years.
Yeah.
The rich have pretty much run Washington for 40 years. They got left out in the cold, and appropriately so. But here's the moment I'm talking about. All of that effort put forward by so many Americans to get to the point where even with January 6th, we had a new president come into office. But that moment on January the 20th with a new president was followed by a moment just a couple of weeks later when we had to pass the first part of the first leg of the bill that resulted in the passage of the the rescue plan. So the first part of reconciliation had to take place a week before the impeachment trial, and then we had to pick up the second part of it. But here's the moment. It's a long lead up to the moment. At about 5:20 in the morning, we had our last vote in this all-night voting on that first leg of the journey. And we had 50 votes. But in order to move it forward, and if it failed at that moment, the rescue plan would have been gone. At that moment, at about 5:20, 5:25, somewhere in that neighborhood of that morning, Kamala Harris walked into the Senate chamber, and she took her place on the rostrum to preside over the Senate as the president of the Senate at that moment. So the vice president gets transformed magically into president of the Senate. And in her capacity as the president of that chamber, at that moment, first woman ever, first person of color in that position, she cast the vote that brought the 50 votes to 51. She cast that vote at 5:34 in the morning. I know that because as soon as she voted, I looked down at my phone and I thought to myself, my God, Kamala Harris had to win that election with Joe Biden to make this possible. But guess what? We couldn't have even gotten to 50 without Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff. And I happened to be in the chamber at the end. So you had this moment where a lot of Americans and a lot of other Americans made it possible for us to get to 51. 50 wasn't good enough. 51 allowed that bill to go forward. And that was, I'll tell you, if that wasn't an affirmative moment, I don't know what there is. And then passing the rescue bill was another moment. And then watching Raphael Warnock yesterday talk about him being in the seat of George, I think his first name was George, Senator Talmadge, who was a racist, a segregationist, and to have him in that seat, casting those votes and talking yesterday about voting rights, those are good moments. So as much as we get frustrated and angry, the Lord has given us a blessing that we're serving with these kinds of people.
Thank you. I'm aware the students will ask some questions. We're coming up on 7:52. I want to make sure, I don't know if there's a hard stop for each of you to have to leave. I want to make sure at least each of the students gets to ask one question, if that's okay. And you can let me know when, if you want in the chat, if we need to end at any particular time. Connor, go ahead, whoever's next.
Yes, thank you so much for your honesty and thoughtfulness in those questions. I will now be turning it over to Yesenia to ask our next question.
Thank you for being here tonight. So my question is actually for Senator Casey. The House just passed the DREAM Act after 20 years of trying to be passed into law. Do you believe that after 20 years of trying to get this bill passed, the Senate will pass this bill as a standalone bill? What strategies should Democrats utilize to gain support to pass the standalone bill? What will it take to get a bipartisan solution, or is our nation not ready for a transformative immigration bill?
It's a great question. And number one is I hope in the Senate we can get to the point where we can pass the broader immigration bill, the immigration reform that has been so elusive for so long. And by the way, I think that's possible in this Congress, even in the Senate. It may require that rules change we talked about before, but on the DREAM Act, I think one of the most important things that we, at least this is a self-criticism of my party in the Senate, or maybe my party more generally in terms of how we advocate. I think sometimes we get into these debates, we get lost in the policy and in debating the merits of the policy. And that's obviously part of what we have to do. But I think it's critically important at these moments that we elevate and affirm, in a sense, humanize the people who will benefit from the passage of the DREAM Act or the passage of immigration reform overall. We haven't done that nearly enough. And I think for just in terms of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, and the DREAM Act, we have to make sure that the stories of those young people, those young Americans, are told. that they make the case. We might gather them at a press conference or in a forum, but the more people hear their stories, what they have achieved in their young lives, what they can mean to the future of our country, that will be the fuel that will allow us to get the momentum and win that battle. Now, too often in the past, we haven't done that. We haven't done that in context of immigration reform more generally. But I think especially in this context, and the other thing we have to remind the American people about is that our government, not the Obama administration, the United States government made a promise to young people. It's a real simple promise. You come forward and provide information and we will protect you. It's real simple. And we have to ask a lot of Americans, not just government leaders. We have to ask Americans, are you willing to be part of the violation of that kind of a covenant that you're going to allow by way of inaction or otherwise to allow that promise to be broken? A sacred promise from the government of the United States to young people across the country who came here when they were very young. So I think we can win this. And as testament to that, I give you one piece of evidence. It's not dispositive, but it's one piece of evidence. Senator Lindsey Graham, I've got lots of reasons to disagree with him and to be frankly angry at him for a number of things. But Senator Lindsey Graham is still working on that DACA bill or DREAM Act with Senator Dick Durbin, who's been the great leader all these years in the Senate on this issue. So that's a good sign of hope that despite the fact that Senator Graham has been in different places than we thought he would be on a lot of things, that he's staying with this issue. So we've got to make sure that we make the case to Republican senators, or if we fail at that, then change the rules and get it done a different way.
Thank you so much for your answer. I will now turn it over to Dennis to ask our next question.
Thank you, Congressman. My questions are for Congressman DeSaulnier and Congressman Welch. The newly enacted American Rescue Plan garnered no support from the GOP and a mixed reception among Democrats. So what does this foreshadow for policymaking in the Biden administration? And should we only expect partisanship?
Number one, let's get the facts straight here, okay? Every Democrat except one voted for that. So there was total support for it. Number two, we've got to have a discussion about bipartisanship. You know, Mark and I are very bipartisan, but it has to be grounded in values in what you're trying to achieve, not just horse trading because there's Republican members and Democratic members. And I would argue that the American Rescue Package is very bipartisan. When you look at the polling, it shows that many of the Trump supporters, many independents are very supportive of the content of the legislation. And the reason I think that is that the legislation doesn't really promote an agenda that has historically just been a Democratic agenda or for our constituency. You know, the checks, you get those whether you're in a red state or a blue state. The vaccine distribution, red state or blue state. The payroll protection plan that helps our small businesses. You're a restaurant in Worcester, or you're a restaurant in California, or you're a restaurant in Oklahoma, you get access to that help. So what I think is the breakthrough in the American Rescue Act, and the reason it, in fact, I see it as having significant bipartisan support, is that we're trying to help everybody who's in a similar predicament from COVID. That's what I think is so solid. And the other reality here is that Mitch McConnell, you may remember when President Obama was elected, Mitch McConnell said that his job as leader, his job, he defined this as his job, was to make certain that Obama was a one-term president. And it's really the most repugnant thing I've ever heard a political leader say. Because bottom line, we have a race, we win or we lose. But once we get elected, all of us who get here have a common obligation to try to do something that's beneficial to the country, period. And it's what I've seen here with the toxic politics is that the leadership on the Republican side, McConnell being the most extreme, but McCarthy now, who's a friend of mine, but he's the same thing over here. There's a fight for failure, and it's all about trying to essentially raise their prospects for getting majority control. So how do you judge bipartisanship now? I think we have to judge it on the basis of, are the goals and is the content of the legislation beneficial to a broad swath of Americans, regardless of what their political point of view is? Mark?
Yeah,
Everybody else. Mark's the most popular member of Congress. McGovern would be, except he's got kind of a Worcester sense of humor that gets him in trouble at times.
I'm popular because my mortality was tested a year ago, and members of Congress sometimes think they're immortal. Well, I would agree, but I think it's important to a lot of people, and I know we all deal with this in the press. I know I deal with it even in a liberal place like the San Francisco Bay Area, where people think there's a symmetry between the Republican Party and the right and the Democratic Party and the left, and I would argue there's not. When my Republican colleagues say we want to compromise, their version of compromise is we give 90% and they give 10. So it's become, and there's reasons for that. You can look at what the Koch brothers did in Republican primaries and driving the party to the right. I'm a former Republican. When I registered to vote many years ago in Boston, I registered to vote as a Republican because I wanted to vote for Ed Burke, a liberal African-American Republican from Massachusetts, to be in the Senate. So I think for your question, I think that party has to figure out what they represent. If they represent sort of the Hamiltonian individual merit, that's fine. That's been part of our discussion. A lot of us would agree with them. We're over with the social contract. That is a healthy, I think, debate in American politics. But it's not. This is not a balanced debate. They're holding on, and as the senator says, they're doing it from a perspective that I think is very, very, very partisan. So we want to work with them, but we can't just accede to extortion.
Thank you very much. And now I'll be passing it on to Connor for our next question.
Thanks, Dennis. Senator Casey, this question is for you. How can the gun violence epidemic be addressed within a polarized Congress? While H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2021, and H.R. 1446, the Enhanced Background Checks of 2021, were recently passed in the House, they face greater difficulty in a split Senate. How will you work with your colleagues in both parties to ensure that these background checks are passed and in the future, more progressive gun control legislation, such as a semi-automatic assault weapons ban, is passed?
Hey, Connor, it's a great question. And you're a native of Sandy Hook?
Yes.
Well, for me, that was a turning point in my time in the Senate. Prior to that, I was in this is just the way I see this issue. You're either in one lane or the other. There's no third or fourth lane. You're either in the lane that says there are common sense measures we should pass, whether it's background check or a ban on military style assault weapons or a whole range of other common sense measures, or you're a not on that, you're a no. And for a long time, I was a no until that moment, that weekend in December of 2012. And I say that because this is an issue that I think we've made some progress on since the horror of Sandy Hook. Some people believed, I guess, that if something didn't pass in the first half of 2013 or sometime in that year after the tragedy, that all would be lost, hope would be dashed. But I think the opposite is true. We're now at a point in American politics where you can now be considered too extreme on the so-called gun issue or Second Amendment issues if you don't support some kind of common sense gun measure. In fact, in the 2018 election, it was a driving force in some of those elections to the detriment of those who did not want common sense measures in place. So despite the fact that there's been a lot of frustration in terms of what the United States Senate has not done. We have not debated this issue or voted on this issue in years. I can't even remember how many years. Literally no debate, literally no votes on these issues because of the stranglehold, starting with Mitch McConnell, but really fueled by the gun manufacturers and the gun groups like the NRA and others. But here's where we are right now. I think it's going to be critically important as the Senate begins to debate this issue of changing the rules. I think it's going to be very important in the near term, the next few months, I would hope, that we could put a background check bill on the floor of the United States Senate or another common sense measure, but background check has probably the highest approval in terms of the American people. Put it on the floor and call the vote. And if we can't get to 60 votes, which we probably would not, it is another demonstration to the American people as to why, first of all, how out of touch the Republican members are on this issue, but also how insulting the filibuster rule becomes in that context. So depending on how we proceed, I think that's one of the best things we could do in the short run, and to put a spotlight on the issue, have a debate, and then have a vote, and then maybe have further debate and vote on another measure, because that would give, I think, a lot of momentum to what I think is a rising tide of opposition to the filibuster being the impediment to progress. But however we get there, whether we have test votes to put the spotlight on it or not, I think it's very important that in this Congress, we figure out a way, just as we must on voting rights, on immigration, on climate, and some other issues, find a way to get legislation passed with 51 votes.
Thank you, Senator. And I will now be passing it to Yesenia.
So my question is to all three of you. What are the social causes that you are passionate about that led you to run for office? And since being elected, have your passions transitioned to new ones?
I think Welsh has the most seniority here. Peter?
Well, it's an interesting story. I got involved in politics in the civil rights movement, and Father Brooks, a great predecessor, former president, made it all possible. I was my sophomore year at Holy Cross, and I heard about a community organization that was starting in Chicago, and it was being run by a Jesuit. And I hitchhiked out on the 4th of July from Springfield, Massachusetts. And my parents were really upset about it, and they thought I'd get arrested, and I did. we got out there, and the neighborhood was complaining because they didn't have any of their garbage picked up, they didn't have any of their garbage picked up, and we brought garbage down to City Hall, and it worked, but it wasn't appreciated immediately. But I ended up staying that summer, and then I wanted to continue for what would have been my junior year. And it was when, had I dropped out of college, then I would have been drafted. It was Vietnam. And my parents were really, really upset, and they went down and saw Father Brooks and told Father Brooks to talk sense into me. And Father Brooks said to my mom and dad, well, we think what Peter's doing is pretty good. And they worked it out for me to be able to go to Loyola while I was out and continue my work in Chicago. But it was a couple of things, because that's where I saw that the incredible discrimination in housing was not just the color of the skin. It was made possible by laws. The laws made it legal to deny a Black family a mortgage. That meant that the family had to buy on a contract and pay twice the going rate. They couldn't get a bank loan, and that was legal for them to be denied a Black loan or a loan, and they had to pay higher interest rates on contracts. So I saw the combination of the power of organizing, which people got together and asserted themselves, and we picketed, and we went to the FHA, and we went to the banks and all of that. But I also saw how the laws really made a difference. So it's a combination of organizing and the necessity of changing laws to essentially provide some opportunity. So I really owe it to the Jesuits at Holy Cross, who essentially said, Peter, that's fine, do that junior year. And it was before we had those junior year abroads and internships. It was completely new, and it was all Father Guinden and Father Brooks.
I'll jump in here if the senator will indulge me, since I'm the junior member in terms of service. Well, I love Peter's story, and maybe it's your generation has your own new unique journey. Our generation certainly did, and I will say that the Jesuits in particular had a lot to do with me ending up in public service. I tell people here in the Bay Area, I'm the Forrest Gump of politics out here. That a lot of my iterations in politics were just fortunate things that happened. And I think that's true for all of us to some degree. But the Jesuits and the social gospel, the Catholic high school I went to, which was in Lenox, Massachusetts, the quote on the chapel, I still remember, was from St. Mark that said, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. And then I was similar to Peter. I was not because I merited the job, but I had a job as a juvenile probation officer in Boston just before and during when another Holy Cross grad, Judge Garrity, did the busing ruling from the federal bench. So I was from a white suburb, son of a judge, and all of a sudden I was, as a young person, impressionable, visiting people in Roxbury who were being adjudicated, seemed like fairly unfairly. So it was impressionable when I went into politics. Because of that, I've always cared about generational changes in kids and disadvantaged kids. So I've done that. And that part hasn't changed, which is why I'm on the education committee and want to stay there. But I think all three of us very much influenced by the Jesuits and Holy Cross about injustice in the social gospel. And for me, it's the same. Probably, I like to think a little wiser, but other than that, it's the same.
No, I would echo both what Peter said and Mark said. For me, it was parents, nuns, and Jesuits. But obviously, my parents, even if my father had not been involved in politics and public service, and he had a really long, tough road. I mean, he ran for governor twice as a young man, and then when he was much older, 46, he ran a third time, and then lost. So he lost 3 times before he won. So his perseverance, his integrity, which was just unmatched, and he was always focused on the vulnerable people his whole life. So he and my mother were great examples for me. The IHM nuns in two Catholic grade schools had a huge influence on me. They taught me, Father Burrows, that even if you couldn't familiarize yourself with large portions of the Bible, you could at least memorize a few hymns. So that's my scriptural depth was limited, but I had a few hymns in my pocket that I could use. But they were, in retrospect, as I think about it, they were really inspiring. Then I was at a Jesuit high school at Scranton Prep, and then went to Holy Cross. And there's no way, I think it's highly unlikely, if not a certainty, that I would not have been a Jesuit volunteer if I hadn't been a student at Holy Cross. And I was fortunate to get not only a great education there, but to be inspired to serve in the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, but then later as a public official down the road. I met my wife, Therese, there, who was ranked light years ahead of me in the same class. So when I say I married up, I'm certain that I married up intellectually as well as for other reasons. But I think those were the influences. And as a public official, it's difficult sometimes to boil it down to one area of public policy. But when I was running for the United States Senate, you run for office. I had been in state office for 10 years at that point, or almost 10 years. You run for office for lots of different reasons. There's no question that ambition is part of it. Wanting to be in a particular place at a particular office at a particular time is part of it. But if you're going to serve effectively, you should be inspired not just by a broad commitment to service, but issues that you want to make a difference in. And I thought to myself, as I began to run, I thought there's probably one issue I hope I can have an impact on, and that's healthcare. But I never could have imagined that after I got elected, that 2 years later, we'd be debating this healthcare bill, which was the most significant expansion of healthcare in a generation. I thought we'd be voting on kind of more limited measures, and the cumulative effect over time would be significant. But I was fortunate to be there at that time to be able to vote for the Affordable Care Act and work for its passage, and then vote to get it passed, as everyone here would remember. And then to have the chance to vote just not even a month ago now on the rescue plan, which, as I said before, will have a seismic, transformative impact on the lives of so many Americans. One number that stood out for me is that the Tax Policy Center tells us that if you're a family with children, you get an average tax benefit of $6,000. That's when you can vote for something like that, that's a pretty good day.
Thank you to each of you. I'm conscious of your time, and I know you've been running off, and tonight apparently there are still some votes tonight, maybe some procedural things I know we went over. We had lots more questions that students were interested in about asylum, about minimum wage, about the environment and the like. So maybe someday we can come back and continue the conversation. But tonight, on their behalf and our behalf, I just want to say thanks for the passion you've shown us, the intelligence, your perseverance, your sense of integrity, to borrow 2 words from Senator Casey in the end. We really appreciate your being here and for all that you represent for the college. So thank you for your work.
Well, thank you. We really enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
Thank
God
you.
bless.
Good night.
Good night.